So who's with us today?
Ben is joining us.
Who's Ben?
So I think the first time I interacted with Ben, my first memory of Ben was that there was this Twitter war around the idea of whether uh, JSON is a real programming language or not.
Jason?
Yeah, we'll talk to him about it. So, but he's a great guy. Like we've been talking, we've known each other for a long time. Since the beginning of the CDK days, he's been pretty involved and pretty interested in what we're doing, but also had like a lot of really strong opinions, which I really, really appreciate. I feel like I'm constantly looking for people with strong opinions, because if they have strong opinions, it means that there's an interesting conversation to have. And spent a few hours with him at reInvent at some point, and had some really, really profound conversations. I think some of my kind of foundational direction came from ideas that Ben
Yeah, we will actually
injected into my brain somehow.
We actually talked about this a couple of minutes ago. That when I saw Ben, it kind of came back to me that I had a small conversation with him over the last reInvent, and he was talking to me about how the abstraction fails. That when you're building CDK, it fails on compile. I mean, when you're trying to deploy, you're having issues that are not related. I mean, are not connected to the abstraction. Basically, your errors in deploy time. It's very hard to understand what are they connected in the CDK. And while he was talking to me in a very Israeli way, he said, "Hey, listen to this guy. This one of the things that he's saying right now. This is why one of the reasons I thought about
doing something.
We're doing Winglang for it. So
okay, let's bring it in.
I mean, the intro was so long. Maybe you don't have to. So here you go, Ben.
Hello, everyone.
Hey. Welcome.
Our viewers are exploded since I last talked about it. So it's,
how are you, man? Where are you at?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm currently in St. Paul, Minnesota. But pretty soon I should be moving to Germany to start a job with Siemens.
Nice.
Where in Germany?
Erlangen, which is outside of Nuremberg. There's a big Siemens campus there.
Wow, that's a big new adventure, huh?
Yeah, it should be exciting.
What are you going to do in Siemens?
The day-to-day is sort of still remains to be seen, but it's a lot about sort of that serverless mindset piece of, Siemens is working to have more SaaS products. And so transforming and putting things in the cloud, putting things on managed services, all of these things under the constraints that its customers have, which is, when you're making things in a factory, everything can't be cloud-based, because if a factory, stops working because their connection to the cloud went down, that's millions of dollars lost a day kind of a thing. So you need sort of staged, what things have to be on-prem, what things can be at different places. And so help with sort of the shift in there in various sorts, I think. But
the decision to go serverless, that's a decision they went with, and now, I mean,
well, I think serverless, I've talked about this a lot. I've written some articles on it. Serverless is more of a state of mind than a technology.
Okay. Interesting.
Right? It's about choosing technology based on how well it lets you focus on business problems rather than technology problems. And if you have very few constraints, like at my last job, iRobot, started connected Roombas over 10 years after the first Roomba came out. So Roomba was already a solid, reliable business, but with no cloud component. And iRobot didn't have a, cloud expertise behind it, and therefore was building all of those things greenfield, which let it say, okay, we can choose these technologies and sort of without any constraints. And so it was able to go, completely serverless, no containers, no VMs in production, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Siemens is a 150-year-old company whose customers are also, decades and decades, 100 years old, those kind of things, and often with a lot of existing IT infrastructure to deal with and existing, user bases and all these things. And so with a lot more constraints, right? With Roomba, you can say, we're going to sell you a Roomba, it's connected to the cloud if you want. A Siemens customer may say, great, you can sell me software, but it has to run on my own Azure account, right? Luckily, Roomba users don't have that, don't generally come with those kind of requirements.
Yeah.
But so when you have constraints, you can't just say, okay, great, we're going to run all the compute on Lambda. You have to say, okay, given these constraints that we have, these customer requirements, these business requirements, whatever it is, what choices are we going to make that allow us to best focus on these things? And an example I give of this is, you might have a requirement to run your workload in multiple clouds. It's got to run both on GCP and Azure and AWS.
Right. Yeah.
And so you might say, okay, we're going to run all the stateless compute on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Because stateless compute is a relatively easy thing.
Easy thing to run on Kubernetes, and then it's not easy anymore.
Well, easy thing to run in general of the sort of distributed computing problems. Stateless compute, statefulness is where things start to get harder. Right?
Of course.
Yeah. So you might say, okay, that's the choice we're going to make there. And a lot of people then take that and say, okay, well, we should run our entire workload on Kubernetes to make it all portable.
Yeah.
But I think in a lot of cases, you might look at it and say, well, we've got a SQL database, and many of the things related to running a SQL database, like taking backups, making sure the state isn't lost, all of those things, Kubernetes isn't actually helping us with. Whereas a service like RDS or Cosmos DB or what have you is very good at taking those problems away from you. And so you might end up saying, okay, we're going to run our stateless compute on Kubernetes and our stateful SQL workload on a platform-specific option.
Service, yeah.
Got it.
And do the duplication of work there, because the balance of it is that it takes these important problems away from us so we can focus on the things. Now, I'm not saying that that's a universal solution or anything like that, but that's the sort of thing where that's a serverless choice, right? It's not, oh, I need to be using these services. It's that my constraints say this, and within the constraints, this is what helps me focus not on solving the technology problem, but on whatever I'm trying to do as a business.
Where would you put? Sorry,
Go ahead.
Would you put a queue in that serverless? I mean,
well, it's a good question, right? You can say, you might end up saying, well, the running Apache MQ on Kubernetes, the operational simplicity of not having to figure out how to run it on 3 different platforms is better. Or you might say, that's not actually, the operational simplicity of the same interface is less good than the operational simplicity of a fully managed service doing it for me. And so I'm going to use the platform service. I can't say, like, that's a much less clear-cut one than like, oh, I can run Postgres workloads in a managed service on all 3 clouds. It's got the same interface for everything. Like, that's a much more clear-cut situation where that's, so I think the serverless answer is always, it depends.
It's more about managed versus not managed, and
well, it's about more managed versus less managed.
So
it
how,
isn't.
Sorry.
This gets a little bit into the topic of the words we choose, which came up earlier. But I tend not to talk about something is or isn't serverless, but is it more or less serverless?
Okay. Interesting.
Right, that there isn't here's a bright boundary around what is serverless. It's, does it take more technology problems off of your plate and onto the provider's plate?
Yeah.
Or in Kubernetes, to the operator.
Well, Kubernetes takes a lot of things off your plate, but leaves you with a considerable amount, which is why, it's something that is useful for certain situations. But if you don't have to use it, choosing to use it instead of a more managed solution for a particular problem is generally not the more serverless answer.
I mean, I'm like, hallelujah, basically, right? Like, it's exactly what we've been trying to say, not that articulately.
Yeah, I
In the
mean,
past,
the difference is there's no one answer, and we both thought yes, there is. I mean, the one answer is Wing. Use Wing.
Yeah.
but basically, what we're building with Wing is a solution to this problem, right? Like, is a way to like exactly decouple those concerns and give you the ability to, make those choices based on your actual needs and not based on some early decision that didn't make sense, that made sense for some spot, right? Like I think like that's exactly.
Yeah.
My question is like, what are we doing about the terminology? Because that's something that's been really bothering us, and it sounds like you've also been kind of trying to say more serverless, less serverless way, the server. And I feel like there's a kind of like the elephant in the room in a way, is that I feel like this terminology has been kind of polluted in the industry.
I mean, I wrote an article earlier this year about the meaninglessness of serverless. So one of the things people are like, oh, serverless doesn't mean anything anymore, and that's bad, and we need to, start making sure that things that get called serverless are actually serverless and all this. And so what I wrote about is that's not a battle worth fighting because you will always lose it. So any term that it describes something useful will inevitably become meaningless. Because it describes something useful, things that are not quite in the boundary of what it is supposed to describe will get described as it for marketing purposes. Oh, this thing is attractive and hot to people. I'm going to label it with this, my thing that's a little bit over here, I'm going to label it with that so that it gets people thinking about it, it gets people looking at it and considering it. And it just incrementally does this until it eventually loses all meaning. Charity Majors was just complaining about that for observability, which has had the exact same thing happen to it. This happened with cloud, it happened with DevOps, it happened with Agile. Like all of these things originally described something that was very useful. And then it starts to get co-opted and you start describing things as, hybrid cloud and private cloud and all these things because cloud is a, buzzword that you can use to get people looking at your product. And that will always happen. It will always happen. There's no way to prevent it from happening. And so instead, the solution is to talk about the characteristics and the benefits, right? So with serverless, we care about like scale to zero and fine-grained billing and more managed options, right? Oh, this particular service is described as serverless, but one of the things it lacks is that it charges you per time, even if you're not using it. Right, so that's less serverless than I want. I want something that doesn't charge me if I'm not putting data through it, right? That kind of a thing. Or, I'd like finer grained billing on this, or I like this service because here are the things that it removes from my responsibility. And so I think the same is true, in the infrastructure as code space of like, okay, why do we want it? What do we like about it? And focus on here's those aspects. And then you get in less fights about, oh, is it labeled this? Is it labeled that?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about it. I'll be I'll be open about it. Like I think like we've been thinking about it from the marketing perspective. Like we've
Of
been
course,
thinking
you have to.
again, marketing as a general term is like, how do we get the right people to know about what we're doing?
Yeah.
And find the value that it adds, because we do think that there is a lot of value there. And I think like that our challenge is to like, we're building something that's so general purpose that it's really hard to nail a specific use case and say, okay, this is the best solution for, I don't know, static websites for sale, right? Like, and I think that to that end, serverless has been kind of like, we've been kind of walking around serverless a long time. I think Eyal and me had our almost first conversation about Wing. Eyal left the room and said, "Okay, yeah, I can see it's like a programming language for serverless."
Yeah. Maybe that's yeah.
But then we've been kind of getting some weird vibe from the market in a way, right? Like there's something around this terminology that's, I feel like it's not. I don't know. I don't want to fall into the trap, but on the other hand, I
Yeah.
think you're right. I think like there's
and also when I was talking with when I just joined the company, when I was talking with companies that were doing serverless, one of the things that I never heard from them is we need to run this on Azure and GCP and AWS. No, the thing I've heard from them is we are wedded with AWS.
with AWS Lambda.
I mean, yeah.
I
Sure.
think in a sense, Lambda, like it was
Yeah.
kind of the reason I'm saying polluted was that it kind of got it associated with certain technologies
Yeah.
that didn't necessarily pan out to the hype that they and I think like your approach is the right approach. Like it's like there's a serverless container solution, right? Like that doesn't mean that it's not serverless,
Yeah.
like in that sense.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, is or isn't the way that I like to talk about it, right? That like, oh, using a service like
Yeah.
ECS
Yeah.
is better than doing container orchestration yourself. Using ECS on Fargate is more serverless than using it on EC2.
EC2, right.
Right? Using App Runner is more serverless than ECS. But also the other bit is that everyone else, serverless got sort of focused on the compute aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
When the whole point of it was much more about using managed services for everything that
Yeah.
isn't your custom code.
Yeah.
And early on, Patrick Dubois, the coiner of DevOps, right? The term he liked about it was serviceful rather than serverless, defining it more about what do you want rather than what do you not want. And that brings it much more into focus that, oh yeah, I'd rather have my stateless compute running on, EC2 than I would my stateful, workloads
Database or whatever, right?
that aren't my custom code running on my own infrastructure. I'd much rather run it that way than the other way around. And so again, it's one of those things. And so again, there are people who, they looked at serverless and they thought, this is just Lambda, and I can't use Lambda for my workload for this reason. Therefore, serverless doesn't have value for me. And therefore, I'm not going to look at things that are labeled serverless or, that kind of thing. So there definitely are people out there who look at that label and they see this is not for me, which isn't true.
Which
you should always look at things regardless
by the way,
of the label.
it's a pretty big segment. Like if you think about everybody that uses Kubernetes, almost has that mindset, and to that end, I think like that's a big battle, right? Like, and I think like it's like I think it's a stupid battle, right? Like it's a battle about the terminology because I'm with you, right? Like I don't think Kubernetes. If you're using Kubernetes, you're not necessarily applying serverless,
some SQS in there.
Approach, right, to your architecture.
Yeah, start bringing in more managed services rather than saying, and this gets a little bit to that thing about, that original kerfuffle, which is that people often see themselves as like, I am a Kubernetes developer, as opposed to I'm a developer who is currently using Kubernetes for, this workload that I'm using. And so they start to identify with the technologies that they use, and therefore that gets sticky for them. Instead of saying, this other choice may help me do the end goal of what I'm trying to accomplish, of what my business is trying to accomplish, it's, this is the technologies that I associate myself with, and therefore I'm going to stick to those tools. It's just not useful. It's not useful to that developer to define themselves that way when there are other tools that they could be using to make their own lives easier and also accomplish the goals that they're being tasked with easier, that kind of a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we just went through a process.
Hallelujah.
We just went through a process to kind of interview 45 companies that has platform engineering or centralized DevOps teams, all of them Kubernetes. And we kind of, we went out of this with the slogan, the developers on those teams are containerized. They basically think I'm running my code inside a container, and I can use an existing queue and I can so
everything else is outside of
outside of
my
my box, and it's one of the things we thought about doing, and I think we should be doing, is basically kind of allow kind of just to remove that question, basically kind of allow Wing to compile completely on Kubernetes, so Cloud Function to run on Kubernetes stack, and then basically for us, it's a different decision whether you what's your infrastructure like and how you code it.
Oh, you like the Helm target?
Yeah, basically. Just the Helm target to run on a
compile your entire cloud application
Knative.
on
Yeah.
Helm.
Well, and I think that gets to this notion that the term infrastructure, which is a term that I'm not a fan of.
Yeah.
And for the reason that if you go back 20 years, the term infrastructure is very applicable. That if you are an application developer, there are layers of the system that you only interact with at a remove. And those things are infrastructure for you. Infra, is a prefix meaning below, and that does really apply in a lot of cases. But I think if we look at modern application architectures, that distinction, there isn't a bright line you can draw of these things are below the things that I am doing. When we talk about raw compute like EC2 or something like Kubernetes, where, okay, the Kubernetes cluster exists below the things that I'm using. But when you start to pull in managed services for things, that distinction, and people keep using it, they'll refer to like a queue as infrastructure.
Right.
And I think that's wrong. Like, sure, the API for SQS and the API for EC2 are both AWS APIs, and just looking at them, taking them at face value, you can't tell much difference. So, one's infrastructure and one's not. But when you use SQS, the choice to put SQS in your architecture means I need persistence for this transaction that's happening. That's business logic to say, I need durability for this, versus, I'm just going to run this, at most once kind of system where it's just going to drop things on the floor. That's something that's coming from your business requirements, whether that has to happen or not.
Right.
And then you get into things like step functions, where it's an orchestration layer that sort of, operates in some sense above your custom code. And so referring to that superstructure, but I don't think that's a good way of conceptualizing it. Understanding these sort of managed services as in the same layer, as part of a holistic application is better there. And when we use the term infrastructure, there's often a value judgment involved of saying, I shouldn't have to deal with that because I'm above it.
Wow.
And that's one of the reasons.
I feel like
and for me, as serverless native is really about, I want to minimize the places that I'm writing custom code. I want to glue together fully managed services for as much as possible, and then sprinkle in little bits of custom code where I have to. And for that, if I'm, I think my code sits on top of infrastructure often gets developers to thinking, coding is the primary thing I should be doing. And if I code more, I have more value. And for me, I'm the opposite. The amount of custom code that isn't directly business logic that I'm doing is stuff that I own and operate.
Tax.
Yeah, it's a burden on me. And so I don't want to be doing it. And so I think that's where, again, this sort of language matters. Like, it shouldn't matter. Ideally, you can just use words to mean whatever you want them to mean. But we're human. Words carry baggage for us. And
I finally kind of found a semantic solution to this problem. I'm with you on the infrastructure. I feel like that's been a big issue. And recently I've been using application and platform. And there's infrastructure in both, right? Like, there's some infrastructure resources, or if you call them infrastructure, great, you can call them infrastructure. I don't mind, but they're still part of the application layer. And some infrastructure that's part of your platform, like your Kubernetes cluster, your VPC, or some shared services.
I think I tend to think about it in terms of resource graphs. And sometimes you can draw a nice line across the resource graph and say, here's a thing that's operated by one group, and here's a thing that's operated by a different group. And then you do have some separation. Often that's sort of a platform versus application thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think, you know, the other bit that gets into that is that with those developers who see coding as their value, and so if they're spending time describing the resource graph rather than writing custom code, they view themselves as less of a developer. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a perception around the way we describe resource graphs as not real code, and that people who spend their time using those programming languages for describing resource graphs are, you know, that's not real code. So maybe they're not real coders, maybe they're not real developers. And so this is where, you know, we get into that talk about what, you know, how do we describe some of the aspects of the CDK and Wing and Pulumi and things without stoking those divisions that have existed in our industry long prior, I mean, decades of this problem. But hopefully when we talk about these tools, we can help make it better rather than help make it worse.
This
full circle, basically.
Exactly.
one thing that kind of I jumped to my head is that when we were talking with CDK serverless developers, some of them said, I don't know if it's, I mean, one of them at least told us that 60% of the time is wiring up stuff, which is basically infrastructure. I mean, when I was writing Java,
it's resources.
You're
wiring up your resources.
Yeah,
because
but
the resources are your application.
But given permission, I mean, when I was using Java, JVM, and I needed something that would be like a pub sub, I mean, then I had it was all running multi-threaded on a single runtime. I didn't even have to give permission. It really felt like this was just application. No one was wondering. It really felt serverless or only application. But it feels like the people that basically need to set up grant permission from one resource to another, it doesn't feel like it's actually code.
But this is exactly what we've been trying to do, right? Like we've been trying to.
Yeah, but I'm asking, he's not. I mean, I'm asking Ben's opinion. He's not part of the.
He's not a wingnut.
No, he's not a wingnut.
Yeah. Yet.
Well, maybe,
not a wingnut yet.
But in the traditional sense of the word, rather than the specific company sense. Yeah, I think one of the things that, you know, sort of serverless native architectures that are very serviceful are good at is exposing complexity that existed but was not dealt with. So that queue that you created and was running single threaded probably didn't have the durability that perhaps you needed, and you spent a bunch of operational time dealing with the consequences of those things.
Or development. Or engineering and engineering.
I have to deserialize and serialize it. I mean, that's
and similarly with security, these things were all running, you know, locally. And so a thing that Lambda being one, you know, an execution environment handles exactly one request at a time. One of the things that removes is the ability for different requests to access the resources of another one. Now, there's some complexity there in that there's a persistent local file system and memory that can get polluted if you're trying to cache stuff. But if you do deal with things statelessly, as like many functions will do, it's a problem. It's a class of bugs that literally just doesn't exist in your system.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about, we designed and built these things, you know, in traditional architectures, we often don't talk about the sort of cost of doing business that people don't really perceive. They pay it, but they feel like it's just a thing that that you do and it's fine. And when you say, I can actually just erase that entire set of problems from you, people often don't perceive the value of that, I think. And so this is where, okay, I'm wiring these things together, but that wiring, often I'm describing directly the application that I want. I mean, this is sort of the step functions thing, right? My orchestration defines my transaction. It defines the action of my system. And in doing so, I can write it in a runtime independent way that needs literally no updates, right? There's no patching of that code on my end, right? You can write a step function and it will just run forever without you needing to do anything to update it. That's not true of that queue that you were, that was embedded in an OS image that you were shipping out somewhere that constantly needed to be patched, that you needed to worry about, oh, what's the ingress into this, VM, all of those things that you have to worry about at this, higher layer where all you're doing is describing what you want. They just don't exist, right? So I think that's where the mistake is thinking about it as, oh, I'm doing these things that I didn't have to do before. You were doing other things, and some of the things you weren't doing, you should be doing.
Right.
The security things especially are one of those things.
But it also didn't scale. My solution didn't scale.
And I think some of the constraints that these architectures create are the constraints that you actually need to deal with if you want to, be highly available and highly scalable. And totally.
And then the other piece then is, okay, well, describing these applications, these resource graphs, is then a task that needs to be, that is getting more attention on making it easier. And this is, what Wing is trying to do, is saying, okay, you can describe these resource graphs easier. And I think that's where perceptions matter a lot. That there are developers who you won't reach. This is that thing, if we go back to step functions, which I love to use as an example for this, because especially, in the early days of step functions, you were just wrestling with JSON for a couple of hours to get the thing working exactly. But at that point, it was, close to maintenance free, right? Close to operationally, I don't really need to worry about it. Like, it's just there and does the thing I told it to do. And people would look at that and say, okay, but I could write 1,000 lines of code to do the same thing, and it feels more fun to do. It feels easier. And then you say, okay, but what's your operational and maintenance burden that goes along with it? And it's, orders of magnitude higher.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, I look at that and I say, oh, I want to do the thing that's more difficult, more frustrating, and will get me this long-term benefit. But there are a lot of developers who just don't work that way. You present them with that and they say, I'm going to take the easy route, even though in the long run, it's going to tie me up in the sort of cost of doing business. So then the question becomes, how do you get those developers on board? And this is where the CDK and Wing and Pulumi and all these tools come in, is they say, we're going to try and reach you where you are to help you take on these tasks without requiring you to do them in a way that you're unhappy with.
Yeah,
I think the way to talk about that.
I think the way I see it is that basically, it's about stepping outside of your comfort zone, right? Like that developer that makes a choice to implement the step function on their own is doing that because that's their comfort zone, and what they have in their environment is the ability to like deploy containers using Kubernetes, right? And so now that's the tool that they have, and that's their comfort zone. And I think like what we're trying to do with Wing and the CDK and Pulumi is about that. It's about bringing, like you say, it's like bringing this problem into the comfort zone as a developer, and the tools that developers are familiar with, and patterns and workflows and all of those things that is the comfort zone of the developer. And it's also a pretty general purpose comfort zone in that sense, right? Like technically you can solve those problems using these tools.
Yes. And I do think that general purpose, and this gets to how do you, I think we should be always pushing to leave our comfort zones in order to accomplish things that we're trying to do in better ways. But again, that's a tall order to ask of all developers. And so But I do think that then the way we talk about those things to developers to say, this is a familiar language. It's general purpose languages. It's, friendly, those kind of things. I think
It's a real
that's where I get off. That's where I say, oh, I think that, fits
No,
into
I
these
totally,
pre-existing
I love
narratives.
it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Um,
I love it.
and I think, that's and the question then is, can you then help, once you've reached them there inside their comfort zone, can you also then help draw them out of their comfort zone to say, okay, today you're trying to do this wiring up of an application where you're very code centric and doing this, and can we help you start being more serviceful? Can it also help you move out of your comfort zone, provide you a path to sort of that doesn't have nearly the same step change in difficulty and frustration, to say, oh, if I'm going to go and try this thing that people are telling me is good, I have to change everything about how I work. If you can say, oh, you don't really have to change much, you just have to think about it a little differently, or do this extra, coding or whatever. That is, a useful thing about how you, that balance between
bring people with you, basically, instead of
how you meet people where they are and then lead them where they need to go.
Yeah. In a way, like we just released the support for containers in Wing, and one of the motivations was to give people who already have containerized applications a way to bring them in as a first citizen to this. I love that term, serverless native environment. Where a container now is like
Well, if it's
just
serverless
another.
native,
Yeah,
there shouldn't be a whole lot of containers in your serverless native. Containers as an orchestration layer.
Yeah,
if you're serverless native.
so we're actually calling it workload, right? Like it's a containerized workload, because there is a use case to use Docker, right, to package software. For some reason, for some people, it's a useful. For some situations, it's a useful technique.
Yes, containers as a packaging. We often conflate, right, containers as a packaging format with containers as a orchestration system.
Exactly.
And containers as a packaging format can be used on, again,
everywhere.
Lambda will run containers as a packaging format, but not operate containers as a. I also think there's the other thing about, in general with all of this, having it be a managed service that does infrastructure as code operations is always preferable. Again, because those are stateful operations and things. But when we're talking about reaching developers where they are often means one developer on a team of people who don't agree or aren't bought into it yet. And that was, one of the one of my complaints about client-side solutions for this is that they're not managed services. But on the other hand, you can also use them in situations where you don't control the whole process, right? And so that's a useful way of saying you're one developer in a team that is doing these in a traditional way, and you think that this is a better way, but you don't get to change, the CI/CD pipeline.
Right.
That's set in stone. That's not your remit to change that. Okay, well, upstream of that pipeline, you can start using this tool and say, and then show, hey, look, this is the value that I'm getting out of it. And of course, if that's a managed service, that gets much harder, because the managed service generally needs to be somewhere more in your pipeline sort of operation.
So I wasn't sure I fully understood. In a sense,
it's like a little rambling.
No. I mean, you said something. That's one of the reasons that I really like, these client-side solutions, because they are upstream, right? Like they're on the left, right? And so you can actually use them in. So I think that's what you were saying, right?
Well, I think that's the value to them. The
That's one of
downside to
the
them, right? The downside to them is that they flatten out the context, right? This was something that Eli, you and I have talked a bunch about, is that, you know, in that situation, well, okay, that thing that you produce, the artifact that the client-side solution produces, and you go put in your existing CI/CD, well, okay, that CI/CD still doesn't know anything about what you originally wrote and the way in which you were thinking about your application. Right, that you expressed it in some language that allowed you to say, this is how I think about this application, this is what I'm doing with it.
Right.
And then when you transpile it into some other format and then hand that off, wherever it ends up, that's always going to be a lossy process.
Right.
And so the further right that the system goes, the more it can know about what the developer originally expressed and communicate with them about that. Like one of the example that I always go to for that is the idea of, you know, wanting a subnet in every availability zone in a region.
Okay.
It's not just that you have some collection of subnets. That is not a list of subnets that happens to have one subnet per AZ is not the same as saying one subnet per AZ.
Yeah.
And so when you flatten that out, when you say, I can express one subnet per AZ in my original source, and that somehow gets flattened out into just that plain list, when someone's going and looking at the deployed application,
of course,
without seeing the source, they're going to see the AZs, but the cloud can't tell them what the developer wanted was this, right?
Yeah.
And so I think these tools that are looking more at, you know, how do we carry more context through and understand more of the developer intent so we can talk, the cloud can talk back to the developer, is, I think, where a lot of the value that we haven't realized yet, you know, as a IAC industry, I think is one of those places, right?
Yeah, I think that in Wing the problem is even more serious because you could do a new cloud dot counter now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as the availability zone example.
Yeah, you don't know what eventually that this will turn into a DynamoDB. In AWS, it's a DynamoDB, but it's a distributed counter. I just want an atomic integer, and so again, carrying that information all the way to deployment and to operation side. That's one of the things that we have on our plate, and again,
exactly.
that's the discussion you and I had in reInvent, where Elad said, listen to this guy about it.
You want that if I go look at your account and I see that I can recognize that it is a counter.
Yeah, of course, exactly. Of course. Yeah. Then this was. I mean, let's just take this all of it to ChatGPT, and let's put this inside our webpage. This is everything.
Super interesting.
Well, we didn't even talk. I mean, we haven't even gotten to, you know, sort of how Wing has you know, interfaces with a lot of these ideas, because I think that's sort of, you know, we've covered, I think, the discussions we've had over the past.
Yeah, which are all of these ideas, basically.
Right, and then Wing has incorporated a lot of it. There are things that we still definitely, you know, I view non-Turing completeness as a benefit rather than a drawback. But I think that's a much more debatable proposition than, you know, more managed is generally better kind of a thing. Some of those basic serverless ones.
Yeah.
But I think Wing, you know, shows a lot of the aspects of these conversations that we've had, and we didn't even get to talk about that yet.
Yeah. Happy to have you here again.
Sure.
If you're up for it. Maybe after you move to Germany, we'll see you freezing in the.
Well, you got to realize St. Paul is colder.
No, it's in Minnesota.
Okay, great.
It's in Minnesota.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be warmer.
My geography is
Minnesota. That's all I know.
So would love to have you again and talk
great.
more. And it's been such a pleasure, man.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
So thanks, and have a great move, and good luck with your new role. And we'll keep in touch and get you do more.